Welcome to Witch Hunt. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
I'm Sarah Jack. Today we're excited to dive into one of the most infamous chapters of American history, the Salem Witch Trials.
But we're not just rehashing the same old stories. We're looking at this historical event through a fresh lens with the help of returning guest author Greg Houle, host of the Salem Witch Trials Podcast.
Greg has a unique connection to the trials. He's a descendant of Thomas Putnam Jr., one of the key accusers in Salem. This personal link inspired him to write his new historical fiction novel, The Putnams of Salem.
In our conversation with Greg, we'll explore how fiction can illuminate historical truths and help us understand the complex motivations behind historical events.
We'll also discuss Greg's innovative approach to storytelling, using a dual narrative that gives voice to both Thomas Putnam Jr. and his daughter, Anne.
So whether you're a history buff, a fiction lover, or just curious about the Salem Witch Trials, you're in for a fascinating discussion.
Let's welcome Greg Houle to Witch Hunt. Thanks for coming. How have you enjoyed completing this project?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me back. I really appreciate it. And I just do want to say that I really appreciate the work that you do with this podcast and getting all of this information out to people and really being a great resource, which I think is very admirable. I've been busy with a couple of different things. The main reason I'm here is to talk about my new book, which is called The Putnams of Salem. This is a project that I've been working on for a number of years that began really as its impetus about 3 years ago. I, like many people, many of your listeners, like you yourselves, am a descendant of people who were involved in the Salem Witch Trials. I am a Thomas Putnam Jr.'s seventh great-grandson. This, however, is something that, despite my lifelong interest in history, never really interested me very much until a few years ago. When I live in LA now, and I was visiting family back east, and we took a trip to Salem with my 12-year-old daughter. And because we had made this trip, I really wanted to kind of just connect her to this part of our history. And something happened, and I'm not going to say it was one of those moments where I just, it hit me. I'm not going to say anything like that because I don't want to assume that that's what it was. But definitely when I was walking through Salem that summer day in 2021, I became sort of obsessed with the idea of what was going through the minds of my ancestors during the year 1692. For me, it was really about that. It was about what could they have been thinking? And one of the things that, we often do when we think about history, particularly history that's happened many years ago, is we tend to flatten things out. We tend to simplify things. And that's why we have a ton of myths that float around when we talk about the Salem witch crisis. It was moldy bread, or it was everyone was lying, or it was all about property. We want that simple explanation for why these events occurred. And for me, it really just, in my mind, I kept thinking, what was Thomas thinking, and what was Anne thinking? Anne Putnam Jr., of course, claimed to be afflicted during essentially the entire year. So, what were they thinking? And so that sort of became my obsession. I wrote a short story about it and then eventually developed it into this novel. So the novel is a first-person dual narrative of both Thomas and Anne. And it basically retells the entire crisis from the beginning of 1692 right through to the end from their perspectives. Obviously, we don't know what was going through their minds, so that's why this is historical fiction. But there's a quote that's attributed to E.L. Doctorow that's something like, the historian will tell you what happened, but the novelist will tell you how people felt. And that's kind of what my goal with this was.
And you also have a very successful podcast, the Salem Witch Trials Podcast, which we love. How has that complemented your work on your novel?
Yeah, for me, when I finished writing the novel, I really wasn't finished with this story. And so I started the podcast because in many ways I think, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but in many ways I think, particularly when you think about the Salem witch trials, it's sort of ideal for an episodic podcast because it's one of those events that so many people know at least a little bit about, but the vast majority of those people don't really know very much about it. So, what I really tried to do with the podcast is create a very short episodes, take a sort of smart brevity approach where it provides bite-sized bits of information that will hopefully provide the context for why this event happened and why it's important still today. And for me, it's been a lot of fun to do a lot of work, as you know, but it's been gratifying to see that it's been relatively successful and that people are finding it. And I think finding it useful and valuable. A lot of people like history for different reasons. For me, I actually like the complexity of it. And when you think about Salem and what happened in 1692, again, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of desire to come up with simple explanations. The reality, as you well know, is that it was not a simple explanation. In fact, it's the confluence of many, many different things, from fear to changing dynamics to conflict with native peoples to, I could go on, as you well know. And so I think being able to unpack some of that stuff, particularly with experts, and have them talking about it and sort of opening people's minds to that idea is something that I really, appreciate doing, and I think is very important.
Yeah, I really liked earlier how you referred to the Salem witch trials as a crisis. I think that's really an excellent way to refer to it. And both your narrative and your episodes from your podcast really do create that context for people.
Yeah, I'm glad you point that out because I've really come to see it that way as a crisis and like to refer to it that way. I mean, first of all, the trials were just a portion of what happened. It's important for people to remember before the court of Oyer and Terminer was set up, there was all kinds of stuff going on, and then there was stuff after as well. It really was a crisis, and I think it's important for people to see it that way. And it, as I mentioned, despite a lifelong passion for history, this was not a topic I was interested in, but it was because I misunderstood. I think I had the kind of popular culture view of the Salem witch trials. It's these fundamentalist Puritans. Aren't they silly accusing these people of witchcraft without really having the context of what was actually happening? I think once you know that, you realize actually it's an incredible moment of micro history that can tell us so much, not only about the time, the world was moving into an enlightenment phase, but also it's extraordinary how much of it still was true for us today, as again, as you well know, and as you often talk about on this show. So I have been really sucked into that and realize the value of talking about it.
It's a topic that seemingly will always need to be discussing because it's about human nature in the end, how we react to those fears and crises.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. And I think that really hits the nail on the head. These are universal feelings and attitudes that will just continue to bubble up from time to time. And I think it's important for us to remember when that's happening. I do think it's unfortunate today how much the term witch hunt is thrown around. I will say, because I think it's sometimes gratuitous the way people do it. But having said that, the powers that set this horrible incident into motion are still very much with us.
We would love to hear a reading from your book.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to read the prologue. Prologue, of course, is the very beginning of the book, and it's just to set it up a little bit. This is the famous story of some of the so-called afflicted girls engaging in fortune telling, which they were said to have done, although we don't know if they actually did. But it sets up the rest of the novel. So I'm going to read from the prologue. And this is from Ann Putnam Jr.'s voice. I hate how Betty holds the egg. She makes such a show of it, covering it up entirely with her hand and fingers, and presenting it before us like some kind of precious jewel. She acts as if that egg matters more than anything else in the world. Her cousin Abby is stretched out with her eyes closed and the slightest bit of a smirk upon her mouth, ready to receive her future. But we are in our usual location in the forest, well hidden from view. Yet it is also frivolous, to say nothing of its immorality. If Betty's father found out, we would all be in serious trouble, and Reverend Paris would forever view us differently. It is a fate far too unbearable to contemplate, yet I must participate in this game, despite the danger. I'm afraid I am far too concerned about what Betty thinks of me. That is why I'm here. Betty is always eager to talk about it. She wants us all to understand that the most critical part of fortune telling is one's ability to properly deliver the question from one's mind through the arm and hand, past the shell and into the egg white itself, which is then to be dropped into the water to reveal its secrets. If this one of these connections is broken, she tells us solemnly and with a seriousness that seems contrived, then the reading will be entirely faulty. Betty says that it takes great concentration to make these connections, and that only a truly powerful person can manage such a thing. What profession will my future husband have? Abby asks the question. It is the same question we all ask, of nobody in particular. Of course, none of us wants to be the wife of a beggar or gravedigger. I wish I could ask a different question. Am I going to heaven? Am I on God's chosen path? These are the answers I wish to know. We call it the Venus glass. But Betty prefers to use the strange word humancy when she is introducing it to somebody new, always taking extra care to draw out her pronunciation to impress them. She will inevitably tell them that it comes from the ancient Greeks. I'm struck by how the Reverend's daughter and her cousin never seem to have the slightest concern about getting caught engaging in such an activity. Given their station, I suppose they believe themselves impervious to risk and incapable of sin. I will never forget the fear on Betty's face after she dropped the egg white into the glass. It was like nothing I have ever seen before, and I pray to God I will never witness such a scene again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
What did you enjoy the most about putting your ancestor into a novel?
It's a great question. I think it's giving them voice. And I will be very clear that I am not that sympathetic. As I was thinking about the characters, I view Thomas Putnam Jr. as this fading patriarch. He's a third generation. His grandfather came over to Salem 60 years earlier. I really wrote him as this character who saw his power slipping. And there's a little bit of a twist at the end that I don't necessarily want to reveal, but essentially his entire story is about regaining that power and seeing the witch crisis as an opportunity to do that. Now, again, this is me being a fiction writer, being able to do that, but I also found it incredibly plausible that someone in his station has been privileged in such a way and holds this sort of privileged position in the community is starting to see the world change around him, and he's starting to lose that power and maybe taking this opportunity to assert himself again. So I enjoyed writing about that and his various monologues that he would have where he would rail against certain things that were happening. So that was interesting. And then with Anne, what was interesting for me is I approached Anne as being this idealized old time Puritan, someone who really wanted to try to live the way you were supposed to live in a world where no one was really living that way. And in spite of doing that, she ended up in the worst possible scenario. So I think being able to tell the stories, give voice to these people who didn't have, they're not fully fleshed out characters, even though we know a lot about both of them and what happened to them, we don't have a true sense of who they were. And so it was very interesting to be able to do that.
I was just, when you were just mentioning Anne's desire to be in God's good grace, to please her father, to please the Reverend, there's one point near the beginning where Thomas Sr. talks about the previous generation. I think it's he who does that, and how things are shaky compared to how it was. And then if you go down one more generation, that's Anne. And that really comes through in things that she's pondering and hoping for and concerned with. That really came through. There's a lot of opportunity to kind of see into some of the relationships because of the conversations. And one of the other ones is with Mercy Lewis. She lived with the Putnams. Who was she?
Mercy, one of the things I'll say just by way of context is one of the fascinating components of the Salem Witch Crisis is its connection to the frontier, to the New England frontier. Of course, the historian Mary Beth Norton can talk a lot about this and was the first person to really make this connection. But as you dig into the various stories, you realize how many people lived on the frontier in Maine in this kind of very perilous situation where there was a lot of conflict between the white settlers and the native communities that lived there for centuries. Mercy Lewis is one of the people whose family did live on the Maine frontier. And in fact, they left the Maine frontier after being attacked at one point and came to Salem, but then went back to the frontier, which, again, as a writer, you wonder about the pull that has for these people. And it was a narrative thread that ran through. It runs through the novel as well. But she had come back after her parents had been killed in a second attack. I believe her sister lived in Salem, but she ended up working in the Putnam household. She also was someone who accused numerous people of witchcraft. She may have been afflicted or claimed to be afflicted as well. And in the novel, I write that her and have developed a pretty close relationship. There's every reason to believe that they probably did have a relationship since they lived in the same household. Mercy was several years older, Anne was the oldest child in the family, so it makes sense that they probably would have. But in many ways, her story in real life and also in my novel is to try to pull in some of that frontier story into the book, because you really can't understand what happened in Salem without understanding what happened on the frontier.
And yeah, another important thing to understanding what happened in Salem is understanding the motivations behind the accusations and get inside the accuser's mind, which is something I love about your book, is that you bring us that perspective that often isn't written about. So thank you.
Yeah, no, and then that's the sort of back to that EL Doctor quote. It's like really trying to give people a sense of what they felt. And when you think about someone, and let me just say by way of disclaimer here that I know that's dangerous in some ways. A historian would say that kind of conjecture is not what you should be doing. And so I fully admit that we have to be careful with this kind of thing. What I think is really valuable, just on a very basic level, is to remember that we're dealing with people who are human beings. They may have existed 330 plus years ago, but they had the same kind of emotions that we have today. They get angry, they get sad, they get upset. And I tried to approach the characters with empathy and to be able to understand. Thomas, it's hard to make Thomas a sympathetic character, someone who accused so many people and clearly enjoyed doing it. And it's not about creating a sympathetic character despite his direct relation to me, but it is about trying to understand what might have been going through his mind and why someone like him, who, as I said, is a fading patriarch of this once great family, why he may have felt the desire to want to do that.
This history and creating historical fiction with this history, it really does give you lots of opportunities to explore the themes that you've mentioned, but those are just a couple. Is there any other themes that emerge that are really important to you?
I'd say the biggest theme is one of fear, and the fear is multifaceted. So you have, in the case, for example, of Anne, you have a 12-year-old girl who is trying very hard to be a good Puritan. And she's listening to the succession of different pastors who at her church, because as you know, Salem just churns through these these pastors, is chew them up and spit them out one after another. And there's a lot of fear. Imagine being a 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old girl and listening to this fire and brimstone and hearing that you're going to go to either heaven or hell and you don't even know which one and you'll never know. And it doesn't matter what you do. And that predestination, to the extent that people believed in it still at that time, was a scary. Then you had the other element of fear with conflict with the native population. As you know, after King Philip's War in the 1670s, really the dynamic changed greatly. And the natives realized that these white settlers weren't going to go away and they were just going to try to continue to infringe on their homelands. And so they realized that they were going to fight back and fight back hard. And that meant some pretty scary situations for a lot of settlers, particularly in the frontier. And so you have those people being attacked, and then those stories coming back, and often that classic game of telephone being played and horrible things being relayed to people back in Salem, which is a relatively stable and safe place for European people to live, but they're still hearing these horrible stories. And so that element is also in there as well. And then there's also the sort of larger fear that I spoke about earlier about their city upon a hill not really being a city upon a hill anymore. I think 60 years on, most people who were Puritans, who were being honest with themselves, had to recognize that their sort of great utopia was slipping away. And so someone like Thomas had a tremendous fear that what had made his family strong was now being lost. And some of that in the book is he has an intense hatred for the merchant class and for, of course, there's the Putnam Porter struggles there. There's this turning of the tide. And I think that also creates a lot of fear as well. So I'd say fear is definitely a major narrative thread that runs the book. I hope is very clear to people.
One of those fear elements, talking about Thomas Putnam specifically and how being in a next generation is affecting him regarding his inheritance and his rivalry then with his half brother Joseph.
Certainly the Puritans of late 17th century were very litigious people. They often sued one another and fought with one another. Some of that was very practical, though, because land was very valuable. And if you had 10 kids, you're going to need a lot of land to pass on to them in order for them to be able to survive, particularly if they're subsistence farmers. You could see how there was a lot at stake when it came to ensuring that land passed on and that generational wealth and all of those things. It's easy for us sitting here now to judge people for those kinds of things, but it was deadly serious. I mean, it was very, very important. And I want to be clear that I'm not saying that's why the witch accusations happened. I know there's a school of thought that it was all about property or whatever. I wouldn't say that at all. I would say that these were very serious issues for them at the time.
With the way you do the dual narrative, you get a look at the adult fears, the fears of a father, the fears of a frontiersman, and then the child or the tween. And the devil is a big character in her narratives and in her experience she's having. That was really done well because I think that looking back, sometimes it's hard for us to understand or to give like enough credit to how much the presence of the devil was horrifying them. And that really came through.
Yeah, that's a great point, and thanks for bringing that up because what I wanted to try to portray, particularly for Anne, as a representative of the younger people involved, but really for everyone, but particularly for her, the fact that the devil and Satan and any kind of evil spirit is a very real thing. And what does that mean exactly? Who is that? What are they doing? How much of it, too, is just in your imagination? But regardless, absolutely, it was a very, very serious threat to people and something that they were very concerned about.
Yeah, I particularly was impacted by her fear of Dorothy because I think that it's when we look at that history and we see how young she was, and there's so much sympathy for her that she had this happen to her life. But then to get into the shoes of Anne, seeing it from an inflicted standpoint and how scary that could be for the afflicted.
Yeah, I think it's again, this is what I was trying to do, particularly for someone like Anne, is, it's our tendency is just to think, well, she must have just been making it all up, right? Like she was just coming up with stories, thinking about the people she knew and all of that. But we know that probably wasn't the case. And so then you try to imagine if a 4-year-old child is haunting you in this way, what would that look like? How would you feel about that? What would you see? What would it feel like? And it really does kind of change. You change that perspective. It really does change how you think about things.
Yeah.
What do you hope people take away from your writing in this book?
I think probably the biggest thing I want people to take away is a sense that we're dealing with real complex people, that they have these emotions, that they existed in a world that was dynamic. As I mentioned earlier, I think our tendency is to simplify history. We see it all the time. As you very well know, you see it all the time with the Salem Witch Trials, but you see it in every aspect of history. People just want to come up with simple answers, simple solutions. It was moldy bread. They were, after everyone was lying, it was all about getting people's property. But in reality, the one thing we really do know is that it was extraordinarily complex. And what that means more than anything is the people involved also had extraordinarily complex thoughts and feelings during this really remarkable year. And so that's what I want to get across. It's not any kind of attempt to restore anyone's good name or anything like that. I think anyone who reads the book will see that Thomas does not come out very great in this story. But what I do want people to get from his story is a sense of why he might have been so active and why he might have wanted to accuse so many people, and and is undoubtedly a sympathetic character. I mean, her story is really, really tragic. And that's something that I also hope people will come away.
It's important to remember Anne was 12 years old, and a lot of those afflicted girls were Betty was 9, Abigail's 11, very young and vulnerable and impressionable.
Absolutely. It's almost hard to believe when you think about it. And I think the thing that always strikes people, rightfully so, is they were essentially the ones who were leading the charge that led to the execution of 20 people. So that's pretty extraordinary that we have such young people. Um, but I mean, whose fault was that, right? That was the adults who decided that they would accept spectral evidence and what. But when you really think about the fact that these are young girls, for the most part, who are genuinely afraid, that's a pretty harrowing to think about. And I think for me, I don't want that to be lost. I want people to recognize that again, they were human beings, lived in this world that was really fraught. And life was challenging and life was scary. And when this was going on, in particular, you really had to multiply that fear many, many times.
When is your book available to readers?
So it's coming out on September 1st. It's being published by Blyden Square Books, which is based in New Jersey. And I'm really grateful to them for taking a chance on a first time author like myself. It will be available as a paperback, also as a digital ebook. And then, interestingly enough, I'm finishing up the audio version with my daughter.
Oh,
She's reading Anne's part, 15-year-old daughter, now 15. Uh, she's reading Anne's part, and I'm reading Thomas's part. So we'll have an audiobook as well. So I'm very excited to have that out into the world.
that's fantastic. How special.
Yeah, it is. And she's done just such a great job really getting into that character. So it's really been wonderful.
How awesome.
We've really enjoyed reading the book, and can't wait for other people to get their hands on it.
So if you want to learn more about the book, you can definitely visit the Putnams of Salem.com. You could also sign up for regular communication with me. I write a newsletter and do some occasional communication about the book and about other things related to the Salem witch crisis and other issues. I also will say that if anyone is interested in having me talk to anyone, I'm always happy to talk about the book or be part of a book club. I really wrote this because I want people to get into it and discuss it. And there may be things you hate about what's written or things that you love, but I'm happy to discuss it all. Please go to the putnamsofsalem.com and you can learn a lot more there.
And we'll have that link in the show notes for you and links to your other stories as well.
What's next, Greg?
That's the $1 million question. I don't know. I really enjoy storytelling, both with podcasts and with writing and video. So all I can say is there will be something. I just don't know what it is yet. That's all.
Yeah. Well, you're doing so well with the podcast, and we wish you the very best with the book. We truly enjoyed reading it.
Thank you so much. And again, I really admire the work that both of you do and really your tenacity. And I just really appreciate it. And I just want to make sure you know that. And please keep up the good work.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's really great to have traveled this, even though it's been a short path, you and us, we've both done a lot in this short time. And to meet you back then and then to be here where your book is almost available and we have almost 100 episodes behind us now.
Amazing.
So I'm like, whatever is ahead for you and us, it's great. And we both know that there's always material. There's always material to address the human condition.
Absolutely. And I think it speaks to the power of just getting this storytelling and getting voices out there. And it's really important. And there may be a lot we can say about the world we live in now, but the one thing that is really positive is the opportunity to get your voice out there in a way that people can find and people can connect with.
Yeah, it was especially rare back then. I was just thinking about Anne Jr. She wouldn't have had a voice if not for being this afflicted person involved in the witch trials.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that actually speaks a little bit to maybe what happened, right? Like the idea that suddenly people are paying attention and care about what you think, it can be intoxicating.
Mhm.
So I think it's, again, one of those things that you just, when you think about people as three-dimensional dynamic human beings, it just becomes this endless possibility that is really just fascinating.
Yeah. Mary Louise Bingham is back with A Minute with Mary.
Was 16-year-old Joseph Putnam given more than his fair share of his father, Thomas Sr.'s estate when Thomas died in 1686? Thomas Sr. provided well for Thomas Jr. and his brother Edward during their lifetimes. Thomas Jr. received 150 acres with buildings where he lived, as well as some additional land by the Ipswich River. Edward received 60 acres and buildings where he lived, plus an additional 60 acres elsewhere. Joseph, the son of Thomas Sr. and his second wife, Mary Varon, received 120 acres with the buildings where he lived, plus 27 additional acres near various meadows in town when he turned 18. However, Joseph also inherited the wealth that his mother brought to the marriage. Joseph aligned himself through marriage to the wealthy Porter family, greatly enhancing his social and economic station, surpassing that of his brothers. Friction existed between Joseph and his brothers, who failed in petitioning the court to break their father's will. Joseph warned his sister-in-law, Anne Carr Putnam, not to accuse him or his family of witchcraft in 1692. As Putnam family lore states, Joseph kept a gun with him and a horse saddled at all times in his barn, where the Putnam Pantry now stands on Newbury Street in Danvers, Massachusetts. Eric Emerson, a direct descendant of Joseph Putnam, and his wife Kathy operate this well-established business. I will be taking a hiatus from Minute with Mary and will return for the following episode on October 9th. We'll see you then. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary.
Now, Sarah has this week's edition of End Witch Hunts News.
Before we wrap up today's episode, I have some exciting End Witch Hunts news for those of you interested in Vermont's witch trial history, particularly the story of Margaret Krieger, a falsely accused Vermont widow. The Pownell Historical Society is kicking off a new series called Pownell Conversation and History on the third Monday of each month. It will be held at the Solomon Wright Public Library at 97 Main Street in Pownell, Vermont. The first installment, on September 16th, will feature Who Was Widow Krieger?, presented by Joyce Held. The session is about the true story of Margaret Krieger, exploring this unique chapter in Vermont's 18th century history. The second annual Witches Walk in Remembrance will take place on September 21st at 1 p.m. Eastern at the Dean Road Bridge in North Pownell, Vermont. This Witches Walk is a shining example of respectful memory, held in remembrance of the only witch trial known in Vermont. The Pownell Historical Society hosts this event, honoring the woman who was accused of being an extraordinary woman with extraordinary powers and subjected to the water test in the Hoosic River. The walk crosses the Dean Road Bridge and approaches her memorial marker as a gesture of remembering her story and the injustices she faced, emphasizing respect and community spirit. Out of respect for Widow Krieger and the ordeal she endured, they ask all participants to be respectful to one another. Here are a few guidelines to follow. Please do not carry signs or banners. Refrain from wearing scary, green-faced witch costumes. This is a family-friendly event, and they want smiles, not tears, especially for the little ones walking. Keep your children close. The memorial marker is near the railroad tracks and the river. Park only where instructed and carpool when possible. They state on their Facebook page, "We look forward to another fantastic community event, just like last year, where everyone enjoyed a wonderful time with other extraordinary people." Want to do something special for the walk? The Witch Walk event is looking for a special duo to help lead the Witches Walk this year. Last year, the walk was led by a duo who set the perfect beat for walking, dancing, and mingling as they crossed the bridge over the Hoosic River. If you and a friend would like to volunteer an hour of your time on September 21st to set the rhythm, please contact them at pownell@comcast.net. For those wanting to show their support, there will be She Was Innocent buttons on sale for $3 to wear at the walk. The button art is an original interpretation of the victim, Widow Krieger, designed by her advocate, Joyce Held. If you haven't already, be sure to check out a previous episode we recorded where Josh and I explored Margaret Krieger's story in more detail with Bennington Museum curator Jamie Franklin. It's available for download, so make sure you listen to that episode for more context and details. Links from this news update will be in the show notes. We are currently running a GoFundMe campaign for our organization to support our participation in 2 important conferences coming up in a few weeks. We appreciate any amount you can chip in.
Thank you, Sarah.
You're welcome.
And thank you for tuning in to this episode of Witch Hunt.
Join us every week.
Have a great today and a beautiful tomorrow.